Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the essential role of women in building sustainable peace and security. We are so pleased that you could join Juan for this presentation, and we're very excited to hear from our own Tanya Henderson, as well as the Honorable Donya Aziz and Colorado State Representative Angela Williams. My name is Udzi Vokiwa. I am the Senior Will Wand Program Associate here at WAND, and I will be running the technology today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions for our presenters, please submit them by typing them into the question section of your panel that's on the right-hand side of your screen. After the presentations are finished, I'll ask the questions aloud. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support directly. Their phone number is 1-800-263-6317. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tanya Henderson, our Women, Peace, and Security Public Policy Director here at WAND. Tanya?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited to join you today. We have a really exciting opportunity to talk about the Women, Peace, and Security Framework and WAND's work on women, peace, and security with the context of our really special guests, the Honorable Dr. Donya Aziz, who's a former member of the Pakistani National Assembly, and Colorado State Representative Angela Williams, who both joined us most recently in Ankara, Turkey, for our Advancing Women's Global Leadership Program. So that's going to be kind of the gist of our conversation today, but I want to just take you through an agenda so you have an idea of what we hope to cover. So first of all, just to frame our conversation, I'm going to do a review of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. We'll then talk about, how the Women, Peace, and Security Policy Agenda applies in the U.S. and U.S. implementation. And then I'll take you to WAND's, expanded Women, Peace, and Security program, and specifically focusing on our Advancing Women's Global Leadership. And at that point, we'll have the opportunity to hear from our special guests about their experience together in this program. So let's get started. So as an overview, the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda is an international policy agenda that promotes the equal participation of women in preventing conflict and securing peace. And it protects women and girls from gender-based violence, particularly sexual violence during war and crisis. So this resolution was adopted unanimously in October 2001 by the UN Security Council. And it really sought to repair the gross lack of equal participation, women's participation in peace and in conflict negotiations across the world, and to really safeguard women and children wherever conflict erupt. And most importantly, Resolution 1325 makes it clear that women's participation and security is critical for international peace and security. So we're not going to build sustainable peace without women being equal partners in this process, in all the processes involved. So why does Security Council Resolution 1325 and the Women, Peace, and Security matter? What is the context we're looking at this in? Well, there are currently roughly 40 active conflicts in the world today. More than half of all peace agreements fail within the first 10 years, and women are grossly underrepresented in peace negotiations. And of these 40 conflicts in the last decade, 31 represent repeated cycles of violence with a disproportionate impact on women and children. So Resolution 1325 came about because there was this realization that with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the nature of war had begun to shift. There was a rise in violent intrastate conflict, as opposed to country versus country or army versus, army. And this intrastate conflict was more focused, concerned ethnic and religious identities, control of natural resources, as we saw in the diamond conflicts, and economic and political power. And as a result, this changing nature of warfare resulted in systematic acts of terror against civilian populations. And we saw this from Bosnia to Rwanda and Latin America to Liberia. For women, The impact of this changing nature of warfare, however, was devastatingly similar across all the conflicts. According to statistics compiled by the World YWCA, 90% of current war casualties are civilians. It's 90%. And the majority are women and children. Sexual violence and rape, abduction from sexual slavery, and for fighting and forced displacement emerged as new tactics of war. So this was really that changing nature of warfare. However, within these same conflicts, women were also emerging as critical actors of peace. They were mobilizing communities across the religious and ethnic divides and using their social roles and networks to mitigate violence and to mediate peace. So some examples of this, in the 1990s, Guatemalan women were involved in negotiations to end a 36-year civil war. They secured important protections for labor indigenous rights, as well as guarantees of a balance in civilian and military power. They also enshrined commitments to women's equal rights and participation in these peace accords. So here you see evidence from around the world and across cultures shows that integrating women and gender concerns into peace-building processes helps promote democratic governments and long-term stability. Another recent example of, the role of women in really, forcing a peace process, an inclusive peace process that looks at these, wide factors that constitute peace, was shared at our recent parliamentarian exchange. Dr. Donya Aziz's colleague in the Pakistan Parliament, Bushra Goher, told us a story of an incident in the Swat Valley region of Pakistan in 2009, where during that time there were daily attacks by the Taliban, and Grain Shuk, which was one of the busiest community squares in the region, was actually renamed by shopkeepers as Huni Chuk, the Bloody Square, because each day residents found 4 to 5 bodies hung from poles or trees. When the local provincial government organized a peace jirga to address this violence, the women political leaders were asked not to attend because they wanted to avoid objections from religious leaders and Taliban supporters. However, the women there did not accept that, and actually in response they convened their own peace jirga and demanded women's participation in the decision-making process. Further, the women sought an independent humanitarian commission to analyze the extent of devastation as a result of militancy and military operations in Swat. So they looked at how the militarization of the local community was really, really supporting and advancing, or at least not preventing the violence that was occurring. Over 600 women from throughout the province participated in this jirga despite receiving death threats and threats of violence. And the event was highlighted widely in the local newspapers and electronic media. And as a result, national political leaders took notice of these women's demands, and the Women's Parliamentary Caucus brought a resolution to the SWAT, on the SWAT peace process to their National Assembly, and this resolution passed unanimously. So I think that's a really great example of how when women really come together and don't accept not being part of the process, they can really expand and achieve more sustainable peace. Hopefully we'll hear more about that from Dr. Donya Aziz later. So to really follow up the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda that was, rooted in United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, sought to collectively seek to address this disproportionate impact of warfare on women and girls, and the necessity of substantively including women in all efforts to promote peace and security. And this resolution was totally necessary, because despite the crucial role that women were playing to prevent and resolve conflict, they were continued to be systematically marginalized during most peace negotiations. Actually, in the last 2 decades, women were less than 8% of key peace negotiations and less than 3% of signatories of the resulting accords. But what strikes me the most is that only 16% of agreements during this entire period even mention women at all. So this is why 1325 and Women, Peace, and Security are so important. So how does UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda apply to the U.S.? Under its presidency of the UN Security Council, the U.S. introduced 3 out of the 4 follow-up resolutions. And it had bipartisan political support. The resolution was passed in Security Council unanimously under a Democratic administration in 2000. And in 2008, a Republican administration sponsored the follow-up resolution 1820 that recognized rape as a tactic of war and a threat to peace and security. Additionally, as we know, U.S. is a major stakeholder in peace processes. We're often the organizers, the negotiators, the mediators, and often, too often, involved in the conflict-affected environments. So application of this agenda in U.S. foreign policy is critical to implementing this agenda both nationally and internationally. So we were so excited because at the 10th anniversary of the Security Council resolution, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced the U.S.'s commitment to develop a national action plan on women, peace, and security. And she recognized at that time that the only way to reduce the number of conflicts around the world and to eliminate rape as a weapon of war, to combat the culture of impunity for sexual violence, and to build sustainable peace is to draw on the full contributions of both men and women in every aspect of peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. A year later, under executive order, President Obama issued an order directing the implementation of the first ever U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. At that time, the U.S. joined 35 other countries. However, there's now 42 countries that have a national action plan to implement Resolution 1325 and the broader Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So just very briefly, there's 5 goals and objectives, 5 high-level goals and objectives in the U.S. NAP. The first is national integration and institutionalization. And this is extraordinary when you really think about it. The NAP applies to federal agencies, all relevant federal agencies engaging or dealing on a foreign policy level. So you're talking about U.S. Department of Defense, U.S. State Department, USAID, Homeland Security, Trade, Justice. So because under the U.S. NAP, there needs to be a national institutionalization of a gender-responsive approach. So it means that each of these agencies have to go and really look at how they're engaging and responding uniquely to the needs of women in their work. Next is participation in peacemaking, peace processes and decision making, and this is really focused on women's equal and full participation at all levels of decision making, from negotiation and mediation to legislation and making policy decisions. Protection of violence, this is focused on really understanding the unique impact of gender-based violence and sexual violence against women and girls in conflict and post-conflict environments. And then conflict prevention, understanding that women have a unique perspective on conflict prevention. There was a film out last spring in Lebanon which showed how the Lebanese women in this small village knew whenever the war was starting because their men started digging up the guns they had buried underneath the backyard in the shed, right? So that women have access to information that can really, help to thwart or prevent conflict. And then access to relief and recovery. And this is making sure that in humanitarian crises and post-conflict environments that women have equal access to food security, education, healthcare, and having their unique needs met. In regards to ensuring that this extraordinary new policy is really fully implemented and sustainable in the U.S., we now are working so hard to pass the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2013. And you can see by my slide, it says this week Congress will reintroduce the WPS Act. It was actually supposed to drop tomorrow, so I was so excited to tell this audience and give you kind of a first dibs. But I think it's going to end up coming out next Tuesday or Wednesday. But again, it's going to be introduced in the House by Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. Co-sponsors are Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas and Congressman Michael Honda from California. And the goal of this legislation is to codify the U.S. NAP, is to make the U.S. National Action Plan an implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, U.S. law. So it's really quite extraordinary, and I hope you all pay attention and make sure to call your representatives to tell them you want them to co-sponsor the Women, Peace, and Security Act, but we'll talk about that more later. So how does WAN's work advance Women, Peace, and Security Agenda? Well, I think, as many of you who are familiar with WAN, you know that we work at both a grassroots and grasstops level, right? We engage our membership and our chapters, and we have our Women and Legislators Lobby, helping to advance our policy at state and federal legislative levels. WAN's Women, Peace, and Security program leverages this work and the resources of both our grassroots and our grasstops to ensure that women are at the tables of power where decisions are being made on U.S. engagement on matters of peace and security. The goal of our work is to strengthen and promote the role of women as agents of change in political life, conflict prevention, and peace building, and to ensure effective implementation of the U.S. Women, Peace, and Security Agenda as directed by the NAP. And we have 5 project areas within our overall Women, Peace, and Security program. As I mentioned, we do a lot of policy work to secure implementation of the NAP. We work to promote how the NAP is implemented in our conflict-affected environments, particularly those where the U.S. is engaged. So that leads us to promote, women's security and rights in Afghanistan. And we are working with academic institutions and international NGOs to make sure that we're really getting the right data and research to our policy, to our policymakers in D.C. And then continuing to support the work, the NGO work on Security Council Resolution 1325 at the UN. But one of our most recent projects that we're really excited and part of the reason we're here today is a partnership that WAN launched last September with the East-West Institute. And we came together with our Women and Legislators Lobby, our WAN Will program, and the EWI's Parliamentarian Network for Conflict Prevention to partner U.S. women political leaders with women members of parliament in conflict-affected regions and emerging democracies, such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East, and North Africa. And the goal was to advance peace and security and human rights, but to really strengthen and promote the role of women as agents of change in political life, conflict prevention, and peace building in the U.S. and around the world. So our most recent exchange was in May 2013. This was the second of our WAN EWI exchanges. And we met in Ankara, Turkey. And we had 16 women from the US, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Morocco, Tunisia, and Turkey. And the women gathered there to participate in peer-to-peer exchange focused on dialogue and information sharing and capacity building. And among the women, they shared extraordinarily powerful stories, and they identified collective policy goals, and really determined some concrete outcomes of what they wanted for this global coalition of women political leaders. But at this point, I'd like to take the opportunity to turn the webinar over to our honored guests, who can really begin to share with you what this exchange has meant to them, what this coalition of global women political leaders, coming together from these regions to advance peace, and how they hope to see their own goal, in advancing this agenda. So I'd like to take a moment and now turn our attention to the Honorable Dr. Donya Aziz.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Tanya. And thank you for the really comprehensive overview of both WAN's work and then the collective work with WAN and the East-West Institute. I will just give a little bit of background. The East-West Institute and WAN came together last year for the first time when we were honoring both the former Speaker of the National Assembly, Dr. Famida Mirza, and Ms. Shinkai, who is a sitting member of Parliament in Afghanistan for both of these women's extraordinary work in promoting peace, security, and women's rights in their respective countries. And personally, this was one of my very exciting interactions with the leaders on an international level because of, I think, the enthusiasm the WAND members exuded when it came to recognizing how they had a role in helping women's rights in countries halfway across the world. I think traditionally, at least my experience from Parliament has been that when members of national parliaments engage with other countries, we are usually engaging with only just the members from the respective national parliaments. And for smaller countries, it works really well, but I think in the US, it's a very large country, and the representatives at the federal level are incredibly busy people and have many things on their plates. I think that because WAND has this collective of representatives at a state level who then are nurtured and guided and hopefully eventually rise up to a federal level, it's really important to engage with them when they're at a state level. A state can be a really powerful tool to get your national congressmen and senators and congresswomen to pay attention to what the U.S. is doing abroad. And I think that when it comes to specifically women, peace, and security for my part of the world, the fact that the U.S. is pulling its troops out of Afghanistan next year, and that after a very long time of fighting the Taliban, the international community now feels that they need to negotiate with the Taliban. This is making women in our part of the world really nervous. Too many times in our recent history, we have seen women's rights being bartered away for so-called peace. And there really cannot be peace at the cost of women's rights and women's liberties. And the only way to ensure that that does not happen is to have women at the tables when this peace is being negotiated. Now, this happens theoretically in a very sound way, I would have to say, on paper. Everyone knows how to make it look good, but practicality is really what we are more interested in. We want to know that the right kind of women are at the negotiating table, not just women who will acquiesce to bartering away women's rights because I don't know how many of the listeners are aware of how politics happens in the subcontinent, but it's a very family-based business, and many times the women who are in Parliament are actually there because of their families, and then can be coaxed by their families to vote one way or another. And we heard numerous stories about how this happens in Afghanistan from Shinkai while we were in Ankara. So the fact remains is that we want to make sure that the women who are at the negotiating table are women who are competent to negotiate, who will stand for women's rights, and who will ensure that any meaningful peace that ensues has women's rights at the front of the agenda. Now, this we're seeing is we don't know exactly how this is going to play out because all of you who have been following the peace process as it has started between Afghanistan and the Taliban, the U.S., brokered by the government of Qatar, we haven't really seen any women or prominent women included in this process. And we feel that with our partnership with WAND and WAND's extensive network of state legislators, that we can have a pressure group. Those of us who are from Pakistan or from Afghanistan now have a network of women who are representatives in the most powerful country in the world and are representatives in the lead negotiating country who has made a commitment and has now or will have in the next week a national action plan which holds the government responsible to ensuring that women's rights and women's security are at the front runner of any peace negotiations. So for us coming from countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan, the women who are in the WAND network, we feel, can be our most powerful allies and our most powerful spokespersons to make sure that their own government follows through with what they are legislating on, and make sure that when the troops leave Afghanistan in 2014, that at least the playing field for what's being left behind is something that is agreeable to women, especially in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan. Because of our proximity to Afghanistan, anything that happens over there does spill over into our country. Both of our countries have in the past, like I mentioned before, seen that it is very easy for our government leaders, especially the male government leaders, and society to some extent, it's very easy for these elements to regress to something that's much more conservative, to actually take 15 steps back and not push for things that the conservative elements that you're negotiating with would find objectionable. So that's just a little bit of the background. I would like to have closed with, and this has been on my mind because this young lady, and I'm sure you've all heard of Malala Yousafzai, the young girl who was shot in Swat almost a year ago for voicing her concerns over girls' education in Pakistan. She was, a hit had been ordered on her by the Taliban. She was 15 at the time. The Taliban did claim responsibility for this act, although sometimes they say that it's not their policy to attack women and girls, but they claimed responsibility for this. They accused her of being a CIA operative, an accomplished CIA operative at the age of 15. Just last week or the week before, Malala made a speech at the UN. And in response to her speech, a Taliban spokesperson wrote a letter to her, and it was publicly circulated, in which they categorically stated that they will kill her. So this is the mindset that we are now negotiating with. This is a mindset that we are being left behind with in the subcontinent, and without support from women from both the WAND Network and the East-West Institute, I think it's going to be really difficult to ensure women's rights are sustained and in some cases even realized in some parts of our countries. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Oh, Dr. Donya Aziz, I mean, I'm just, thank you so much for sharing with us your perspectives, both on you know, the need in the state and the region for how U.S. and U.S. women can really support the women of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and also your extraordinary insight into the nature of politics and you know, mapping out kind of what could unfold over the next year or 2 years. So I really, really want to thank you for joining us today. I think we can all say that this is very, very poignant. And I also want to just thank you for your own courage representing, being a representative of Pakistan and really taking a strong role and leader as a woman in the Pakistani National Assembly, because I know for years you advanced critical legislation to protect the rights of women and girls there. So I want to thank you for that. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn over to Colorado State Representative Angela Williams, who joined us in Ankara, Turkey as one of our U.S. women legislators, and who is also a member of our WAN's Women and Legislators Lobby, as well as our board on our board. So we're so thankful that Representative Williams had time to join us today. So I'd like to turn the mic over to you, Rep. Williams.
Well, thank you, Tanya, for the opportunity to be able to participate today. I want to just share with the ladies that have joined us today that being able to participate in a delegation that is working on behalf of women, peace, and security and human rights was a real, it was almost a life-changing event to understand the rights that we fight for here in the United States and have some success in regards to women equality. However, what our sisters in the Middle East experience from Afghanistan and Pakistan and Tunisia, Morocco and Turkey, you would probably just, it would probably leave you speechless, because there are rights that we have that they do not have when it comes to women's peace and security, the social issues, human rights, and education for children. So I just want to say that it solidified why I joined the WAN board, and it's going to elevate what I have to offer to help with this partnership with the East-West Institute and the Parliamentarians Network for Conflict Prevention. But as far as the experience itself, I think we all thoroughly learned a lot on this delegation trip to Ankara, Turkey. And I think you first have to understand that Turkey has 3 executive branches, just like we do here in the United States. They have an executive, legislative, and a judicial system. We were fortunate enough with the leadership under Tanya is to be able to visit with the Deputy Minister of Family and Social Policies to understand these issues in their countries, and to be able to leverage the relationships with the deputy ministers. And I think the one with the Minister of Family and Social Policies was most encouraging to us, because first of all, she was a female and she understood the issues that we were bringing and the value of what we brought to help our sisters in the Middle East. We also had an opportunity to visit the National Assembly of Turkey, the Defense Committee of Human Rights and Equality for Opportunity for Women. And all of these meetings were very productive. We were received well. And if you can imagine walking into a committee and the way we do here in the United States, and the more people that show up, the more serious people will take you on the issues that you bring before them. So imagine having 20 or more women around a table in front of a committee and being able to dialogue on the issues of security and peace for women. Some of the outside opportunities that were also enlightening is that we had an opportunity to visit with representatives of what we would consider a Chamber of Commerce. And what we found is that, you know, business is doing well in Turkey, but women are just now slowly breaking into entrepreneurship. which is, I'm sure, something, we have pretty prevalent here in the United States. So I think that's a whole area that we can also help represent our sisters over in the Middle East countries as they move forward. We had an opportunity to visit a youth center. I would consider it more like a YMCA here in the United States, a very, very large building structurally, but what the women are doing there is they're helping youth who may have dropped out of school or are homeless get skills in the areas of, they had a barber shop and a salon there. They had a music area, just about every skill you can imagine housed in one building to help the children and youth who may be without a home or some type of income. So the overall trip was just a wonderful experience. In our day-to-day sessions with our sisters, we learned of many stories and actual hands-on challenges that they experience in their own countries, as Donya referred to. And I think what was most pushed forward with all of us is we were doing what we would probably consider a simple task of writing an op-ed when we do so often here in the United States, but as we were teaming up with our partners, parliamentarian sisters, we had to be careful about the way we would write that message, because they were joint op-eds from the legislators and the parliamentarians in the United States and from the Middle East. But to hear the stories of the challenges and the risks that women take to speak out and have the courage to be voiceful on issues that are important that we've discussed, we had to be very careful about what we wrote. Because what we didn't do, you heard Donya speak of the young lady who was shot, and they told her they were going to kill her. They literally mean that. I think in the United States sometimes we may get some type of threat as legislators, but this is literally, we could write things in these op-eds that would put their life in danger, which is, of course, what we don't want to do. So the opportunity to write an op-ed that I did with my colleagues on women's rights and choice was very delicately put together, but yet it was a learning opportunity for all of us to be able to partner again with our sisters and help move the message forward on leveraging the message on women's peace and security and how important their voices are as we move forward. And I want to encourage the women from the United States who are on the line is that we are more powerful together as women, whether it's right here in the United States or it's across the seas. And we really need to get involved and support our sisters. I want to encourage more women to participate in the WPS organization. WPS has a great presence on the Hill, and the opportunities to get in front of our congressional leaders and speak to them about how we leverage the relationships when we have certain peace treaties or it might be financial support in our Middle East countries, and make sure that they understand that women have a voice, and in foreign countries we hold them accountable for those we're providing assistance to. And if you hadn't had an opportunity to go out to the WPS website, we're having a conference in September, which we will again reunite with some of our sisters in the Middle East to continue the work forward. We will be lobbying on Capitol Hill in front of our congressional delegations. And I think the stronger our voices are, the more that we can help our sisters in the Middle East area for what I consider what we might take for granted or it's easy for us to have a voice here in the United States where we serve, and help women in the Middle East become a stronger voice so we can have more peace and security in the Middle East countries. Tanya, that's my 2 cents. Again, it was just an incredible opportunity, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to attend and move forward with the work that we're going to do to help our sisters.
Thank you, Representative Williams. I mean, you can continue every time I hear from you and hear your passionate call. I'm just always reminded of what a champion you are for ensuring that women's voices and perspectives are at the table, on the Hill, where it matters, and here in this case, really ensuring that, bringing our attention to how important it is that we protect our women leaders, political leaders in Afghanistan, Pakistan, in the larger Middle East region, having their voices heard loud and clear, and that we do not, as Dr. Donya Aziz said, let their voices be negotiated away in what is being referred to as a peace agreement. So on that note, I just want to thank you both so much. Wand, as I mentioned, we're actively working on introducing the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2013, so make sure to pay attention to our action alert so that you can call your representatives. This legislative act will make implementing the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda through our National Action Plan law. So right now the U.S. National Action Plan is an administrative policy, but through this act we have the opportunity to ensure that no matter who comes in the next administration, or who leaves the House or Senate, that that the National Action Plan and Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, that's implemented through all of our foreign policy initiatives. And then I want to also highlight, both Dr. Donya Aziz and Representative Williams, call to really make sure that we protect and promote Afghan women's rights through this withdrawal of 2,000 troops from Afghanistan in 2014. But I know that Aziz, you probably have questions waiting for our special guest, so I don't want to take up any more of that time, so people have time to ask questions.
Yes, Tanya, we do have a number of questions, and for those of you who have not yet submitted your questions, just a reminder of how to do so. There should be a question box on your attendee panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and please type your questions in, and I'll ask them aloud. So our first question is from Alice Dahl, and Alice, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Alice says, Dr. Aziz's point about the importance of having the right, competent women at the table during exit negotiations is crucial. Fair legislation, including equal rights for women, is vital. However, there must also be an impartial and independent justice system to uphold these laws. Will a competent justice system also be part of the negotiations?
That's a really good question, and I've got to say I do not know, because the negotiation is taking place specifically for Afghanistan. I would hope that a competent justice system is something that all parties at the negotiating table could encourage the Afghan government to pursue, but it's such a vital element of government and of a country running smoothly, and yet it's also such a sovereign subject that I don't know politically or diplomatically how much any third party could say when it comes to the Afghanistan judicial system. but I would encourage you to most certainly, write to your congressmen and congresswomen and senators and representatives so that when they meet Afghan delegations, they can, very gently point out the fact that Afghanistan needs to have a sound judicial system, and also a judicial system that has a fair representation of women in it. In Pakistan, although we have quite a robust judiciary, and although we lack in some women's rights issues, for the most part we have been able to have women excel in all fields. However, unfortunately, we have not had a woman on our Supreme Court bench yet, and or even on a high court bench for our provinces. And this is something that comes up time and time again in our own meetings in Pakistan. And needless to say, many women's rights groups and politicians are trying to find a way to get women into higher judicial seats. Thank you for your question.
All right. Our next question is from Erica Fine. Erica asks, what is the single most helpful thing U.S. women legislators and their constituents can do to help bring female politicians to the negotiating table in the current negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban?
Is this a question for me?
For you or for Tanya, whichever one of you thinks would prefer to answer.
Well, I can say from our point, something that we have encouraged through the networks from the East-West Institute and WAND is that when the members of WAND or the other parliamentarians in the East-West Institute's network, when they meet with their ministers or their prime ministers or their presidents and representatives, that they push constantly and say, what about the Afghan women? What about the Afghan women? For instance, if you know that your representative from your state is going to be on a mission to Afghanistan, you know that they're going to meet Karzai, you know that they're probably going to meet the defense minister and the foreign minister, but you can write to them and say that I know you're going and I would like for you to meet the Afghan women parliamentarians. I would like for you to ask Karzai and the foreign minister how many women are part of the negotiating process. So it's just a pressure group that the networks provide, which is a very powerful tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to just add a little bit. Thank you, Donya, for your remarks there, and absolutely. We support, any opportunity you have to say, what about the Afghan women? And in regards to the, to WAND and the Civil Society Working Group, what we're calling for is to actually engage Afghan, demand that Afghan female leaders are engaged in the peace talks, that 25% of Afghan women, and that's in alignment with the Afghanistan Constitution that requires 25% of women represented. That's their quota. So that's what we've been specifically asking. And then I think to to really use the National Action Plan. I mean, this is, Department of Defense has an implementation plan, on women, peace, and security. State Department does. And so this, this is currently administrative policy, and to use it and say, under the National Action Plan, women need to have full and effective, representation and participation and conflict prevention and be involved as equal partners. I'm saying equal partners. You can't see I'm making quotes, air quotes. In all peace negotiations at the first line of the U.S. NAP. And I think that we just have to keep raising our voices, because I think that if you reflect back, when the U.S. first began, there started being newspaper articles and op-eds about the U.S. Having negotiations with the Taliban, and the reaction. A week and a half, 2 weeks went by before I saw one article that even mentioned how this could impact women. New York Times, Washington Post, you know, paper after paper, and nobody was mentioning the women. So this is where we use our voices to ensure that women's voices in Afghanistan are included in the peace process.
Great, thank you both. Our next question is from Catherine Horvath. Catherine asks, when can we expect a report of implementation of the first year of the U.S. Action Plan?
Oh, good question. I think that, well, I know that there was a report done. State Department submitted a report to the President, and I think they turned it in spring of this year, 2013. We haven't seen a copy of that report, and I know that members of Congress haven't seen a copy of that report yet as well. They are mandated after 1 year to at least do an initial report, and there was one. So I think anybody could research, you know, State Department report of U.S. National Action Plan, and we can see if we can get a copy. So there is one done. And what was your follow-up question? Could you repeat the question?
That was the question.
Okay. So there has been one done. There will be, in 3 years from the drafting of December 2011, there will be a very extensive review process, which I think is probably at least what it's going to take to start to get gender mainstreaming, you know, institutionalized in DoD. So we've got a ways to go before this whole concept is fully integrated, but it's there, so we need to make it heard.
Great. Our next question is from Deborah Curry. Deborah asks, Afghanistan is a patriarchal society. What can be put in place to ensure that policy changes involving women's rights will not be ignored?
Donya, do you want to take the first jab at that question?
Policy changes from like a U.S. perspective?
I guess, you know, policy changes within Afghanistan itself.
Within Afghanistan itself, well, I mean, Afghanistan has, like Tanya mentioned, a constitution which does recognize women's rights. And when the government of Afghanistan and the U.S. said that they were going to embark upon negotiation with the Taliban, one of the first caveats is that the Taliban have to respect and recognize the Afghan constitution. Now that's like easier said than done. I know that they've already tried to table and pass legislation. Actually, if you remember, Tanya, it was while we were in Turkey, to limit the number of women's seats in the Afghan parliament. And, you know, I mean, it's really a catch-22 situation when you think about how the representatives in Afghan's parliament and government live. They really live day to day, and if they are required to make a policy change that hinders women's rights on the one hand, or, you know, risk losing their lives or their family's lives on the other hand, I mean, everyone's a survivalist. They're going to choose the latter, and it's difficult for it to be imposed from the outside. What can be done from a U.S. policy perspective is that the U.S., in recognizing the peace talks with the Taliban, now will have a legislation that they themselves have to abide by. And when it comes to giving U.S. aid money or any other aid money to Afghanistan, the U.S. administration is going to have to say, well, you have to abide by our legislation, or we have to abide by our own legislation, which means that women's rights have to be realized in Afghanistan for us to be able to give you money. And that's the kind of carrot and stick approach that has been used in our part of the world for decades. And I think it's going to have to be used again for this situation.
I think that's a great suggestion. I would definitely think that there's going to be a big shift as we have a drawdown in military and combat troops to, to more international aid and monetary support as is needed in a number of cases to really ensure that the fragile democratic institutions in Afghanistan are maintained and that women's, health, education, and jobs, that the significant gains they've made in the past 12 years are secured. But I think that we can make that, we can tie our own U.S. purse strings to women's equal rights and the U.S. NAP specifically, right, tying it back again to our own foreign policy statement on this.
All right. Our next question is for Representative Williams. And the question is, in terms of policy implementation challenges, what are some of the commonalities you discovered amongst the women state legislators from the United States and the members of Parliament through the exchanges that you've participated in?
Thank you, Aziz. In regards to the policy commonalities, what we find is that we all are on the same path of legislation that protects women's rights to choice, protecting our children, ensuring that they have access to education, and on the human rights. I myself did not get an opportunity to talk extensively about legislation where we have commonalities, but those are the high-level areas. And I know we did talk extensively again about the women's rights for choice. And we know that for pro-choice candidates here in the States, that we believe that women should have the right to make choices about their own bodies and not having government tell us what to do. And I think that's the biggest commonality in regards to common issues of legislation that we discussed.
All right, great. Well, thank you to Representative Williams, to Dr. Donya Aziz, and to Tanya. We really appreciate your time and your information. And thank you again to everyone on the phone and on their computers at home who joined us. We appreciate your time and attention. We just wanted to give you a heads up that we'll be sending out follow-up materials. When you exit the webinar, you should see a survey, and we really appreciate your feedback and hearing from you about our webinar. We'll also be sending you an email linking to the recording of this webinar and with a copy of the slides. So thank you so much again to everyone who participated in the webinar. And with that, we will end.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.